This morning, questions are growing louder from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle about President Trump's strikes on what he says are drug boats, with 8 strikes in the Caribbean and now 2 in the Pacific. And as the administration now dispatches an aircraft carrier to Latin America, lawmakers are pressing for more information, from the intelligence used to target the boats to the change in protocol from what used to be a Coast Guard duty to why they haven't been asked for approval. And joining us now to discuss this and more, MSNBC national security reporter David Rohde, MSNBC senior Capitol Hill reporter Ali Vitale, and former commander of the U.S. Southern Command, retired General Barry McCaffrey. Ali, these strikes are beginning to get serious pushback on the Hill, including from some Republicans. What are they saying?
They're concerned about the lack of input that they have here, as well as when the president starts talking about the potential to make these more than just the strikes that we've seen on sea, but now to bring them potentially to land. That's something that the president has only floated, but it started Congress talking about the idea of who has the ability to authorize that kind of force. And if it becomes a larger ground war, what role should Congress be playing? Should they be consulted? I mean, listen to what some of these lawmakers have been saying in recent days, Anna.
The administration needs to give insight into Congress. That's part of it. If this was happening with this level of insight under the Biden administration, I'd be apoplectic.
The White House and the Department of Defense could not give us a logical explanation on how this is legal. They were tying themselves in knots trying to explain this.
I've been invited to no briefing, but a briefing is not enough to overcome the Constitution. The Constitution says that when you go to war, Congress has to vote on it. I would call them extrajudicial killings.
If this president feels that they're doing something illegally, then he should be using the Coast Guard. If this is an act of war, then you use our military, and then you come and talk to us first. But this is murder. It's sanctioned murder.
So there are questions about the legality, the morality, the ethics behind what the administration is using to make these decisions in the first place. But then, of course, there's also the larger theme that those of us who follow Congress have been following the entirety of this year, which is the ways in which Congress is typically ceding spaces, whether it's on appropriations or now authorizing various military strikes, the way that they're ceding that space to the president. In this case, at least, we're hearing a little bit more bipartisan outcry, but we'll see if it actually amounts to any kind of pressure that the administration would then have to bring Congress in on this. So far, doesn't seem like that's happening.
I mean, there's been a blatant lack of transparency and also ability to verify what they've been saying in terms of who's been targeting and what kind of information is backing up why they believe that these people are doing X, Y, or Z. David, we have now seen 10 strikes in recent months. What do we know about the latest one?
The really unusual ones were 2 that were off the coast of Colombia. This all began as an effort to pressure Venezuela, which is actually a small player in the drug flow to the United States. There was a recent one in the Caribbean as well. And I think the question here, and General McCaffrey can answer this better than I can, is how do you win a war on drug trafficking? Like, what's your definition of success? I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, and you wonder about getting into sort of a whack-a-mole situation where you're taking out these boats, and does it really stop what's happening in terms of the flow of drugs? And then the second issue, is this an effort to sort of pressure people around Maduro, the authoritarian leader of Venezuela, to turn on him and force him from power? That, critics have said, is regime change, and that's a big change from what President Trump campaigned on. But the stakes of military action, wherever they are in the world, by the United States are very large. So the question is, where does this lead? And again, how do you win if you're trying to counter drug trafficking?
So, General, given, as we reported, more military assets are being deployed to the region, including some 10,000 military personnel. Now you have the aircraft carrier Gerald R4 going. What does that signal to you about the plans, where things are, and what questions do you have about this operation?
Well, look, the problem is real. There has been a massive increase in cocaine production in Colombia in particular under this leftist former ELN guerrilla, President Petro. Venezuela is a transit country. Maduro and 14 of his associates are under indictment for essentially being part of an ongoing government link with criminal cartels. And the outcome of this is probably 30,000 Americans a year or so are dying from cocaine overdose. Now, having said that, as David points out, how do you deal with this problem? We're assembling in the Caribbean the most sophisticated warfighting capability the United States has, particularly the carrier Roosevelt, with a very advanced high-tech capability to do pinpoint massive air attack against heavily defended areas. But it's sort of like a sledgehammer trying to kill a gnat. If you want to reduce cocaine production in Colombia, not Venezuela, you have to resume aerial fumigation and cut down on the coca crops, which have grown massively. So the question is the Trump administration actually going to conduct further ground and air combat operations against Venezuela and Colombia? No good will come of it. It's not only of dubious or non-existent legality, it just isn't going to work.
Allie, are lawmakers getting briefed at all on these strikes?
No, and I mean, you heard from Senator Paul there, the fact that he hasn't been briefed, but also that a briefing wouldn't be enough, because the central concern here is that if this turns into a larger war effort, the authorization will not have gone through Congress. Now, presidents have taken advantage of this leeway before. They've tried to play in the gray space, but this is yet another example of the way that this particular White House has tried to sort of cut Congress out of the process. We talked about appropriations earlier with pocket rescissions from the White House. That's just one example. But this is yet another one. And I would even broaden it out further. We know that the Pentagon in recent weeks has tried to clamp down on the ways that Defense Department officials interact with the Hill, basically saying that they need to clear information with the DOD before they bring it over to Capitol Hill. But oversight is the central function of the Congress, especially over an entity like the Pentagon that gets so many hundreds of billions of dollars of federal government money. It's an open question now of how good those briefings are going to be. But I mean, we used to cover briefings all the time. And I even asked one of the members on the House Intel Committee recently, well, have you guys been briefed on, for example, the ceasefire deal in Israel? What's going on behind the scenes there? And they said, no, we haven't been briefed on that or much of anything else recently. And I think it does go to show there's such a chilling in the communication between various entities of the administration and Capitol Hill.
And a halt of information being passed along to lawmakers and to the American public. What we do know, at least based on what we've been told, is that at least 43 people have been killed in these 10 strikes. We know at least a couple of people survived. One of those people reportedly was turned over to Ecuador and has since been released because authorities said that they found no evidence that he had committed a crime. So there's a lot of he said, she said going on. Allie, thank you for your reporting. General, what are the rules for when a president can just carry out an attack without congressional approval?
Well, that's actually the central question. I heard Tom Nichols talk about it in a very coherent way. Can the President of the United States use the armed forces of the United States as his personal tool to point them at a target and tell them to go kill somebody? The answer is no. They're supposed to not brief Congress. They're supposed to get Congress's approval for any unilateral actions on emergency conditions under the War Powers Act before they continue. And none of that's happening. The president talks about maybe we'll go down and talk to Congress. But as Senator Paul points out, this isn't a briefing question. It's a constitutional question of the War Powers Act. So I think we ought to be concerned about not just Venezuela and 10 boat strikes. We ought to be concerned not just about a potential disastrous land intervention in Colombia or Venezuela or Bolivia or Peru. We ought to be concerned about who has the power to check the President of the United States as Commander-in-Chief.
David, could these strikes move past boat strikes and onto land?
Well, the president himself late last week talked about land strikes, and that, to me, signaled Venezuela. There is an opposition there. The Nobel Peace Prize went to Maria Corina Machado. She was barred from running for president. The opposition said they won the election there in 2024, but the Maduro regime refused to give up power. So General McCaffrey's right in terms of that it's a growing problem in Venezuela, and there's also this issue in Colombia. But the past success in Colombia and the thing we see all over the world is that U.S. military efforts are, can be very effective in the short term, but in the long term, you need allies on the ground. So this is a big escalation. If there is a ground strike, members of Congress will be upset, and it's very unusual. There was a policy paper that was developed by the Obama administration. It was actually used by the first Trump administration that said drone strikes could be carried out when the U.S. was almost certain the identity of the person they were going to kill and was also certain they would minimize civilian casualties. President Obama, his administration did that. There was criticism of it. This is just strikes when, as far as we know, they do not know who the people are on the boats. Senator Paul raised this. So this is sort of lowering the bar on the U.S. carrying out fatal drone strikes abroad.
David Rohde and General Barry McCaffrey, thank you both. Obviously, much more to come on this story.